On today's World Insight, a bigger CIFTIS kicking off with choice words from Chinese President Xi Jinping, a digital platform for services making a difference in global economic recovery. Days after the full exit of U.S. and allied forces from Afghanistan, the focus now is on Taliban talks of an inclusive government. The likely outcome of the talks, or regional perspective, answers from a ranking Pakistani diplomat familiar with the ins and outs of governance.
This is a decisive moment, I think, for the country. There's an opportunity to establish long-lasting peace.
And China's policy on Afghanistan, respect for all Afghans and sovereignty, the steps towards rebuilding the country from an international relations scholar.
How to pacify the panics among all the Afghanistans. How to restart the government works.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei from Beijing. The China International Fair for Trade in Services begins Thursday in Beijing. This year, participants from more than 150 countries and regions are attending the global fair online or in person. The fair is seen as a platform for China to showcase the growth of its service sector, which accounts for over 50% of GDP. While the recovery of traditional manufacturing has been hindered with a resurgent pandemic, trade in services, though, has gathered momentum worldwide. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said the country's overall trade in services rose 6.7% year-on-year to nearly 2.4 trillion yuan in the very first half of the year 2021. Chinese President Xi Jinping kicked off the global fair with these words.
Trading services is a key component of international trade and an important area of economic and trade cooperation between countries. It has a big role to play in fostering a new development paradigm. We will work with all other parties to uphold openness, cooperation, mutual benefit, and win-win, share opportunities in the growth of services trade, and promote world economic recovery and growth. We will open up at a higher level by implementing across the country a negative list for cross-border services trade, and by exploring the development of national demonstration zones for the innovative development of trading services. We will create more possibilities for cooperation by scaling up support for the growth of the services sector in Belt and Road partner countries, and by sharing China's technological achievements with the rest of the world. We will further improve rules for the services sector by supporting Beijing and other localities in piloting the alignment of domestic rules with the ones in high-standard international free trade agreements, and in building demonstration zones of digital trade. We will continue to support the innovation-driven development of small and medium-sized enterprises by deepening the reform of the new Third Board and setting up a Beijing Stock Exchange as the primary platform serving innovation-oriented SMEs.
Well, in New York, Jim Rogers, world-renowned investor and author, joining us. In Beijing, Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. And in Brussels, Daniel Grohl, a member of the board and a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. A lot of new information coming out from the Chinese president at the ongoing Chinese trade fair on service trade. Among them, I'll just go very quickly, which we already illustrated in details earlier with that quote. One is about the negative list. The other is about building the mechanism through Belt and Road. The third is about trying to meet the standards of higher international trade agreement. Fourth is about establishing more third board, this time Beijing Stock Exchange. So a lot of new information to you, Mr. Rogers, as investor. Which one more crucial?
Well, they all sound exciting to me, especially a new stock exchange for innovative companies. That's great. The more money you can raise for innovators and entrepreneurs, the better any country, any society, any economy is. But Tianwei, Belt and Road is very exciting too. That's one of the most exciting things in the 21st century.
To you, what about among all the list, Mr. Guo, which one?
I think from a practical point of view for the European Union, of course, this negative list approach is the one that makes most sense. China is a huge market potentially for services. And if one could reach an agreement also in the multilateral framework on a negative list, that would be a major step.
All right. Professor Liu, you have a different choice?
I'm left with no choice but the globalized rules that are compatible to international standard. I think it is really referring to the general agreement on trade in services under WTO, and now the RCEP, particularly the e-commerce chapter that is there to be implemented by the end of the year.
But we noticed the Chinese president did not reveal any specific time. Of course, it was much more specific job of those in the Chinese government to illustrate that. But when you look at what's going on right now, particularly, Mr. Rogers, with the encouragement of investing in service trade in the health sector and also in the financial sector, without mentioning other sector, entertainment and high tech, is it interesting to you?
Tianwei, nearly everything in China is of interest to me. As if China continues to open up, China is going to be the most important country in the 21st century. I mean, if they close off, then there'll be a problem again. But no, so far, everything is great opportunity for all of us.
I do read a little bit from your answer, Mr. Rogers, though, that you seem to suggest China don't close up. It seems that what you're trying to say. Professor Liu, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, this is the most fundamental one because China benefited over the last 40 years from continuing opening wider of the Chinese door, and it is now there to dismantle some of the walls that are still blocking over there. So the introduction of negative list and the continued connection with the higher level standard of service trade is really an elevation of the Chinese commitment and the resolve to further on this road.
Okay, Mr. Guo, how attractive still China is?
Well, for European investors, China is the one big market in the world which grows. Europe grows very little. Our markets are stagnant almost, whereas in China, many things are moving. The first thing which was opened up was trade in goods, industry, and now the logical next step would be services.
Yeah. Let's see some of the specifics. Probably the Beijing Stock Exchange is one of the things that catches everybody's eyes. Mr. Rogers, we've already known that in China, several boards. In Shanghai, they got two, Shanghai Stock Exchange and then also the Shanghai Star. And then you have Shenzhen as well, both the Shenzhen Stock Exchange and that for the, the high-tech enterprises. And you also have in Hong Kong, they also have one, Hong Kong Stock Exchange and one for the high-tech companies all over the world. And now Beijing is going to have one. So you see all of this interesting development and certainly competition. What would that mean?
Well, competition and opening up is always good, especially if you're talking about capital for entrepreneurs and new businesses and innovators. That is fantastic. Look out the window. You see what China's done in the last 40 years. That's because they did have capital and access to new ideas, and that's fabulous. You know, Tianwei, once upon a time, America probably had 8 or 10 stock exchanges. We were a much smaller country and a much smaller economy. Now we only have 2 stock exchanges, but this is a normal process when companies or countries are developing, which China is. The more the merrier, the better. Let us all have lots of money to access and to help entrepreneurs develop new ideas,
well,
which
Mr.
China
Rogers,
so far is doing. Let's hope they continue.
I know, Mr. Rogers, you want to be upbeat in the program, but what does that mean, the competition within the country? Also with the thought that, you know, these days, Chinese enterprises, particularly high-tech enterprises, going to stock exchanges in Europe and America particularly is becoming extremely difficult and challenging. So more stock exchanges within China for Chinese companies and international ones. Very interesting idea, isn't it, Mr. Rogers?
It's a fabulous idea. As I said, America once upon a time had 8 or 10 stock exchanges, much smaller country. Now, Tianwei, when I talked about closing off, it's not good for China to close off, but America, look, America's showing signs of closing off too. If the world closes off, we're going to have problems. If everybody continues open and engaging with each other, then we can have opportunities.
Mr. Guo?
I think Europe shows the opposite danger. In Europe, we have 27 stock exchanges, and that's really too many. So I think Mr. Rogers is right. A couple of stock exchanges which compete is good, but it shouldn't be too many.
And how do you see the potential of Beijing's possible NEDQ? It's called the National Equities and Development Quotations.
I must say, is it really a task of a government to decide where a stock exchange should be located? Maybe one should have left that to the specialists, to the investors, maybe the high-tech entrepreneurs. Whether Beijing is a good place or Shanghai or Shenzhen, I really don't know.
You do see a lot of competition among China's metropolitan cities, Professor Liu, in developing finance industry and also service trade.
Yes, I think now, we have 3 growth centers. The Pearl River Delta area represented, supported by the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, and the Yangtze River Delta area supported by the finance from the Shanghai Stock Exchange. Now, with the integration of Hebei, Tianjin, and Beijing, we do need another pool of capital that supports this polar of growth. So that's one point. The other is that if you look at the past 20 years, China really evolved from the single type of factory on incremental growth, and now by combining capital with the manufacturer and now the high-tech manufacturer, then you can really go for explosive growth. But one thing we have to caution, and that if we build up too many financial platforms without translating into real productivity, and that's a danger, and that's the danger the government is getting very much alert, as to Ant Financial and other type of big platforms. So now the Beijing one is really targeting to raise those hidden champions who may handle only one IP, and then make a special parts that's fitted for high-level manufacture, and that's the one I think the Beijing Stock Exchange is really catered to support.
Okay, another point, very important, also about how to align China's rules and regulations with the so-called higher standards of international free trade agreement. That's very interesting to me, because you see, Mr. Guo, the discussion and debate going on at WTO about where the future is. You also see the flourishing of regional platforms since the international one, global one, is not functioning as well as it did. And now China also talking about, after entry into the WTO, 20 years this year, where is it going? So this catering to the higher standards of international free trade agreement, to me, very interesting. What about to you? What does that say?
Or aligning the internal rules and regulations to WTO standards or the global standards is always a key step in integrating your economy into the global economy. And I think that's a very important step. And now it is happening in services, which is always the most difficult part to integrate, because in services you have a lot of domestic rules and regulations, domestic customs, and also domestic interest groups, which do not want to have this change in the rules. We have experienced that in Europe, even across European countries, it's sometimes difficult to trade in services. So if China really were to align its own service regulation with global standards, that would be a very major step ahead.
Of course, the timeline of this is not clear, Professor Liu, at this point, though.
Yeah, it is a very complex one because China was rather cautious. Before it was only open for trading goods, and then we ushered in the joint ventures with approval system, and now the service sector. First of all, where is the border for its definition? For example, within gas, education is part of the service, but now China would take it more as ideological, construct. So, we have to define that. The other is that right now, because China by itself, the service takes 56% of the entire GDP. So therefore, it is time for China to consolidate within its own border with the right type of standard, and then to match the global standard. And that's something that we are also be able to work with the Belt and Road countries, which President Xi mentioned to a great deal.
All right. Since Mr. Rogers today, you pretty much to me has been a one-liner, so I want you to have the final say and also the final share of insights for this discussion. Mr. Rogers?
If China continues to open up and adopts international standards so that international investors and customers know that everything is legitimate and honest, China's going to be the next great country in the world, Tian Wei. You should teach your children Chinese.
Well, you did. Good for them. We also want to learn English as well. Jim Rogers, Danny Guo, Liu Baocheng. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Say hi to them, to your children and your family. Thank you, and be healthy. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, days after the full exit of the U.S. and allied forces from Afghanistan, the focus now is on Taliban talks of an inclusive government. The likely outcome of the talks, for a regional perspective, I asked a ranking Pakistani diplomat familiar with the ins and outs of the governance. Her conversation next. And meanwhile, we're looking at China's policy on Afghanistan, respect for all Afghans and sovereignty, the steps toward rebuilding the country, from international relations scholar.
How to restart.
Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Efforts to form Afghanistan's new government appears to be picking up steam as the Taliban urges holdouts in the north to lay down their arms. They have called upon resistance fighters in Panjshir Valley to negotiate a peace settlement. Unfortunately, that already broke down. In the capital, Kabul, Taliban leaders said that talks are still underway for an inclusive government that will respect the people's rights and freedoms within Islamic law. The group is expected to name a supreme leader soon. How will the new government, quote unquote, likely turn out? Will it get international acceptance? For answers, I talked earlier to Maliha Lothi, who served as Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and earlier also ambassador of Pakistan to the US and to the UK. And here are her takes. In Islamabad, I'm joined by Maliha Lathi, former permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations. She was also the ambassador to the US and the UK for Pakistan. Ambassador Lathi, what a pleasure to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
There are so many things going on. How do you see the latest going on in Kabul with the new government likely to be formed? But how well informed do you think the rest of the world will be about this quote-unquote open and inclusive government?
It's another turning point for Afghanistan, which, as you know, is Pakistan's neighbor. I think we're all waiting. The international community is waiting. Pakistan is waiting to hear and see what the new government in Afghanistan will look like. As you know, the Taliban have promised an inclusive government, which means it has to be a broad-based government. Afghanistan is an ethnically divided country. So the only way that it can achieve peace and security is to have a government that reflects and represents the various ethnic minorities and political groups that are important in Afghanistan. So this is, this is a decisive moment, I think, for the country. On the one hand, there's an opportunity to establish long-lasting peace. But on the other hand, there is the fear or the challenge that there is so much that the new government has to do in order to reach the goal that we would all like Afghanistan to reach, which is one of peace and prosperity for its people.
Before that happens, already a lot of things going on. For example, the fighting going on between the Taliban faction and also the Northern Alliance, or shall we say those in the Panjshir Valley. It was no surprise to anyone, but still, do you see the danger of so-called civil war once again on the rise in Afghanistan? Or the Taliban could pretty much control most of the territory?
Well, I think the hope is that they're able to control their own territory and establish a degree of security. It will take time. And I think the international community should show patience because don't forget, Afghanistan has been through not just 20 years of war as a result of the US foreign military intervention there, but it has also in the last 4 decades seen conflict, strife, civil wars, and of course, foreign occupation.
Right.
So, this is a war-ravaged country.
Yes.
It will take time for them to establish the kind of peace and prosperity that we would all like to see for the Afghan people. I think a very important test for the Taliban will be if they can govern their country. Because, the Taliban leaders have been saying that they want those people who fought against them to continue to serve the country because the Taliban don't have enough people in the ministries that can run the country and that can govern the country. So this is going to be a big test.
But on the other hand, we see the neighbors of Afghanistan all are quite worried and nervous about what to come. Pakistan, I guess, is one of those that's standing out because if you look at Taliban as a terrorist organization, the Pakistani Taliban is being categorized as many as the terrorist organization, while the Afghan Taliban, who are now trying to form a government inside Afghanistan, is not anymore. How do you see, the earlier link between the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban, and how do you see they are different from your perspective?
What Pakistan has already done is to ask the Afghan Taliban to ensure that what is called the Pakistani Taliban is not given a place in their country, a safe haven, so that they can carry out attacks against Pakistan. We have been reassured by Taliban leaders, but an assurance is words. We would like to see these words matched by action. But I can tell you, it's not just Pakistan that has a concern. Every neighboring country has a concern. For Pakistan, the concern is, of course, the Pakistani Taliban. For China, it is the ETIM. For the Russians, it is Daesh or ISIL. For the Americans also, it is Daesh. For Iran, they are very, very worried about how the Taliban will treat the Shia population of Afghanistan, because in the past, there were atrocities that were carried out by the Taliban against the Shias. Now, what the Taliban leaders are saying is that they have actually made a promise to the international community that they will not allow the soil to be used against any country. No country will be attacked from the soil of Afghanistan. But we have to wait and see. Again, we have to see how effective they are in containing these groups and ensuring that they're not a security threat to any neighboring country.
What does that mean for Pakistan? Of course, one of the closest neighbors, and also one of those countries who the U.S. Has been accused a lot of in not doing enough against the Taliban.
Well, I mean, look, the allegations against Pakistan, I would simply reject them because, you know, it is a way in which those who could not win this war try to find an excuse or a pretext or a scapegoat.
Interesting.
So I think that is something that, you know, they have to figure out for themselves. After all, if they spent 20 years in fighting this war and were unable to win, the reason must lie with them and not with Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, how do you see Pakistan would engage while at the same time maintain its leverage over Afghanistan?
I think the important question really is whether the international community will remain united, because no single country, including Pakistan, has enough leverage now to nudge the Taliban towards a certain direction. But if there is collective action, if the international community is united, then there is a good chance that the Taliban will try to translate the promises they've already made to the international community into actions. So I think the important issue is going to be collective leverage exercised by a united international community.
According to Washington, the kinds of leverages comes in different categories. For example, confiscate the earlier, properties and belongings of the Republic of Afghanistan, and now to provide that to the new government in Afghanistan. That's what the Americans consider as leverage. They also have drone attacks, which of course also kill many civilians at the same time. They think that will be the leverage against the terrorism inside Afghanistan. They also have the leverage, as they see it, sanctions against this country. But that's their version of so-called leverage. What kind of leverages are you talking about, Madam Ambassador?
I think we have to look at both incentives, which is a positive leverage, and disincentives, which are negative. And some of the ones that you've listed are mostly negative. We believe, like China, like Russia, like other neighboring countries, we believe that it is time to engage positively, and we can hold out leverages, or we can use leverages like a diplomatic inducement of international recognition, that is positive, international assistance, investment. These are all positive ways in which I believe the international community should influence the Taliban. Because if only the stick is used, and in fact, if the stick is used at all, we believe it will have a counterproductive effect. We've seen the history of sanctions against most countries. It has an opposite effect. If anybody wants to change any country's policy behavior, it is best to do so in a positive way.
Now, before we go, Madam Ambassador, last question for you. Very complicated geopolitics. And many wonder whether countries have wrongly prioritized their most important tasks, whether it's against the terror or against another country. For example, whether the U.S. is thinking about only against China while ignoring other priorities. But that's only one thing. The thing is, we have a very different world today compared to 20 years ago. So when you say international community coming together, how realistic is it? And what kind of picture, what kind of mechanism do you think they will be able to do in order to come together, in your words?
I think there is already international consensus on core expectations of the international community. Everybody wants to see the same outcome in Afghanistan. And I would say that there are three key elements of this. One, the expectation that Afghanistan's soil is not used for attacks against any other country. So that's on counter-terrorism. The second is, this is not in any order, all are important. An inclusive government, broad-based, broadly representative. And third, respect for women's rights, human rights, and international humanitarian law. So I think on these issues, because don't forget, these are all reflected in a UN Security Council resolution of the 16th of August. And all 15 members of the Security Council obviously agreed to the statement that they issued. But the one challenge I think that we have seen recently in the last meeting of the UN Security Council is when China and Russia abstained on a Western draft resolution, and finally it went through. But China and Russia disagreed with the way in which several things were mentioned in this draft. And there was also this feeling that it was pushed very, very much in haste. So, that points to the challenges ahead. It's very important, at least for the UN Security Council, to remain united on Afghanistan, to have the same perspective. Because if there is disunity, I think that will give the Taliban the space to wriggle out of some of the promises that they have made, which will not be good for their country, and certainly it will not be good for the neighbors and for the rest of the international community.
Ambassador Lothi, the Pakistani permanent representative to the United Nations and former ambassador from her country to the US and the UK, sharing the Pakistani perspective. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says China is keen on a friendly policy towards all Afghans, respect the nation's sovereignty, and provide assistance in rebuilding. In the coming weeks, what can China do to help all parties come together for regional peace? How should the international community respond in the long term? Hu Shisheng, the director of the Institute for South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, shared his insights on Afghanistan. Take a listen. We see the promises from the Taliban as well, that Afghanistan will not be used as a place for any terror and terrorist groups.
After the August 15th, the headache started. How to run this country, how to pacify the panics among all the Afghanistans, how to restart the government works, how to restart the economic activities. There are still some anti-Talib military movements in Panjshir Valley. So all things are gushed into one place and require the Afghan Talib to make decisions as quick as possible. I think it is a big challenge, but whether the Afghan Talib can stand up this kind of challenge, overcome the current difficulties, it is really a big question. It doesn't mean that Talib will not maintain their commitment.
People can say, well, if you don't have the capability, you do not dare to make those promises. If those promises are made, not being met, they're called empty promises.
This is also one of the, maybe a positive point that Afghan Talib can get from the deadly terrorist attack, that we need international community support, all kinds of support, so that we can addressing more challenging tasks.
One of the things is whether the Taliban will be able to separate itself from all the other terrorists, whether recognized or not by the international community, as some argue that they have been growing up their capacity together with those, and they have quite interesting interactions over the history of Taliban.
First of all, Afghan Talib is not a typical terrorist group. We call it a rebellion. Even the Americans call it a kind of rebellion forces or anti-government forces. We know that there are about 20 around regional and international terrorist groups still hidden in Afghan Talib. ISKP is an exception because ISKP is the enemy of Afghan Talib. Afghan Talib fight against ISP sometimes even jointly with Afghan government troops, even with US troops, sometimes coordinating with Pakistan troops. So they are targeting against ISKP, but with many other terrorist groups like the Uzbek Islamic movement, like the ETIM, even like Al Qaeda, they still have some linkage. Sometimes very difficult to seed their linkages or delink the relations with them, because on the ground they are interlinked with each other. They're fighting with each other. They even marry with each other, take good care of their families with each other. So very difficult. Even the top commanding officials of Afghan Taliban issue order that we have to delink, we have to decoupling, we have to seed or to cut off the relations with those terrorist groups. But how the local commanders, the local Afghan Taliban can cut off their relations with their relatives, with their neighbors, with their roommates, with their fighters, friends. So very difficult. It will need some time. But this, of course, will erode the confidence of the international community on Afghan Taliban.
All right.
It will, it will damage the Afghan Taliban image in the international community. Afghan Taliban, the top leaders have to address this kind of issues. But still, let's be a little patient with Afghan Taliban.
Mr. Hu, besides being patient, there are a lot of things that needs to be handled, because people are wondering, after August the 31st, which is the deadline, the Americans promised to the Taliban to withdraw from Afghanistan. What's going to be the mechanism to fight against terrorism in the region? Earlier, U.S. there, 20 years. Whether successful or not, that's another question. But it established its own mechanism together with the forces there, a system fighting against terrorism. Now, August 31st after, what's going to happen? There's a vacuum.
The first responsibility, of course, will be loaded upon Afghan Taliban itself. If Afghan Taliban want the international community to accept it, to financing this regime, it has to take determined activities of anti-terror policies to drive them away or flush them outside of Afghanistan territory. It is their priority of priorities. But we have to face in the ground realities. But if the Afghan Taliban lack the capacity, but sometimes the local Afghan Taliban commanders even lack the willing, what can the outsiders do? Especially those who are facing the spillover threat from those terrorist groups, what they will do. Currently, we have some regional mechanism like that China, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We have dialogues. We have anti-terror cooperation in the past. But of course, it is with the former, we can say, the former Afghanistan government. Now, of course, it will be Afghan Taliban-led government. I think that Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi already sent this kind of message to Mullah Baradar, who led the delegation to China, to Tianjin, that we want Afghan Taliban's commitment in fight against ETIM. And Afghan Taliban leader promised this. So even then, so maybe in the future, China, Afghan Taliban can carry the bilateral, even trilateral with Pakistan. And we still, in the past, we have some mechanism, quadrilateral mechanism, like among China, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. So in the future, we can even restore it. Even before the new government come into office, the three parties, China, Pakistan, Tajikistan, can still working together closely to save, to cement to cement our borders. So in this regard, I guess China, Russia, Tajikistan can also cooperate. I noticed that 2 days back that President Putin had called President Xi. They're talking about the situation in Afghanistan. Of course, they talk about how to help the Afghan to sailing through the current transitional turmoils, and of course about jointly fight against terrorism. So we have this kind of cooperation bilaterally, trilaterally, quadrilaterally. Even we have SCO. Even within FCO framework, we have Afghanistan liaison, this kind of working mechanisms. We can use this platform to unite all the neighbors of Afghanistan to try to do our respective efforts to fight against the terrorists. Of course, fighting against terrorism should be coincided, or should be accompanied with financial support, with humanitarian assistance. I think that there will be a humanitarian crisis is emerging from the horizon. We have to take actions as quick as possible. Of course, UN is also a framework. UN can also call the emergent meetings to addressing this kind of situation.
Hu Shisheng, Director of the Institute of South and Southeast Asian and Oceanian Studies from China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Thank you so much, sir, at this critical time for your insights and expertise. Really appreciate it. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching, and bye for now.